Apprenticeships of Mark Twain. In 1850, the oldest Clemens boy, Orion, returned from St. Louis, Missouri, and began to publish a weekly newspaper. A year later, he bought the Hannibal Journal, and Sam and his younger brother Henry worked for him. Sam became more than competent as a typesetter, but he also occasionally contributed sketches and articles to his brother's paper. Some of those early sketches, such as The Dandy Frightening the Squatter, 1852, appeared in Eastern newspapers and periodicals. In 1852, acting as the substitute editor while Orion was out of town, Clemens signed a sketch W. Epaminondas Adrastus Perkins. This was his first known use of a pseudonym, and there would be several more: Thomas Jefferson Snodgrass, Quintus Curtius Snodgrass, Josh, and others, before he adopted, permanently, the pen name Mark Twain. Having acquired a trade by age 17, Clemens left Hannibal in 1853 with some degree of self-sufficiency. For almost 2 decades he would be an itinerant laborer, trying many occupations. It was not until he was 37, he once remarked, that he woke up to discover he had become a literary person. In the meantime, he was intent on seeing the world and exploring his own possibilities. He worked briefly as a typesetter in St. Louis in 1853 before traveling to New York City to work at a large printing shop. From there he went to Philadelphia and on to Washington, D.C. Then he returned to New York, only to find work hard to come by because of fires that destroyed 2 publishing houses. During his time in the East, which lasted until early 1854, he read widely and took in the sights of these cities. He was acquiring, if not a worldly air, at least a broader perspective than that offered by his rural background. And Clemens continued to write, though without firm literary ambitions, occasionally publishing letters in his brother's new newspaper. Orion had moved briefly to Muscatine, Iowa, with their mother, where he had established the Muscatine Journal before relocating to Keokuk, Iowa, and opening a printing shop there. Sam Clemens joined his brother in Keokuk in 1855 and was a partner in the business for a little over a year, but he then moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, to work as a typesetter. Still restless and ambitious, he booked passage in 1857 on a steamboat bound for New Orleans, Louisiana, planning to find his fortune in South America. Instead, he saw a more immediate opportunity and persuaded the accomplished riverboat captain Horace Bixby to take him on as an apprentice. Having agreed to pay a $500 apprentice fee, Clemens studied the Mississippi River and the operation of a riverboat under the masterful instruction of Bixby, with an eye toward obtaining a pilot's license. Clemens paid Bixby $100 down and promised to pay the remainder of the substantial fee in installments, something he evidently never managed to do. Bixby did indeed learn a word Twain insisted on, in the river, but the young man was an apt pupil as well, because Bixby was an exceptional pilot and had a license to navigate the Missouri River and the upper as well as the lower Mississippi. Lucrative opportunities several times took him upstream. On those occasions, Clemens was transferred to other veteran pilots and thereby learned the profession more quickly and thoroughly than he might have otherwise. The profession of riverboat pilot was, as he confessed many years later in old times on the Mississippi, the most congenial one he had ever followed. Not only did a pilot receive good wages and enjoy universal respect, but he was absolutely free and self-sufficient. A pilot, in those days, was the only unfettered and entirely independent human being that lived in the earth, he wrote. Clemens enjoyed the rank and dignity that came with the position. He belonged, both informally and officially, to a group of men whose acceptance he cherished, and, by virtue of his membership in the Western Boatmen's Benevolent Association, obtained soon after he earned his pilot's license in 1859, he participated in a true meritocracy of the sort he admired and would dramatize many years later in A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, 1889. Clemens's years on the river were eventful in other ways. He met and fell in love with Laura Wright, 8 years his junior. The courtship dissolved in a misunderstanding, but she remained the remembered sweetheart of his youth. He also arranged a job for his younger brother Henry on the riverboat Pennsylvania. The boilers exploded, however, and Henry was fatally injured. Clemens was not on board when the accident occurred, but he blamed himself for the tragedy. His experience as a cub and then as a full-fledged pilot gave him a sense of discipline and direction he might never have acquired elsewhere. Before this period, his had been a directionless knockabout life. Afterward, he had a sense of determined possibility. He continued to write occasional pieces throughout these years and, in one satirical sketch, River Intelligence, 1859, lampooned the self-important senior pilot Isaiah Sellers, whose observations of the Mississippi were published in a New Orleans newspaper. Clemens and the other starchy boys, as he once described his fellow riverboat pilots in a letter to his wife, had no particular use for this non-union man, but Clemens did envy what he later recalled to be Sellers' delicious pen name, Mark Twain. The Civil War severely curtailed river traffic, and, fearing that he might be impressed as a Union gunboat pilot, Clemens brought his years on the river to a halt a mere 2 years after he had acquired his license. He returned to Hannibal, where he joined the processionist Marion Rangers, a ragtag lot of about a dozen men. After only 2 uneventful weeks, during which the soldiers mostly retreated from Union troops rumored to be in the vicinity, the group disbanded. A few of the men joined other Confederate units, and the rest, along with Clemens, scattered. Twain would recall this experience, a bit fuzzily and with some fictional embellishments, in the private history of the campaign that failed, 1885. In that memoir he extenuated his history as a deserter on the grounds that he was not made for soldiering. Like the fictional Huckleberry Finn, whose narrative he was to publish in 1885, Clemens then lit out for the territory. Huck Finn intends to escape to the Indian country, probably Oklahoma. Clemens accompanied his brother Orion T. Eventful in other ways. He met and fell in love with Laura Wright, 8 years his junior. The courtship dissolved in a misunderstanding, but she remained the remembered sweetheart of his youth. He also arranged a job for his younger brother Henry on the riverboat Pennsylvania. The boilers exploded, however, and Henry was fatally injured. Clemens was not on board when the accident occurred, but he blamed himself for the tragedy. His experience as a cub and then as a full-fledged pilot gave him a sense of discipline and direction he might never have acquired elsewhere. Before this period, his had been a directionless knockabout life. Afterward, he had a sense of determined possibility. He continued to write occasional pieces throughout these years and, in one satirical sketch, River Intelligence, 1859, lampooned the self-important senior pilot Isaiah Sellers, whose observations of the Mississippi were published in a New Orleans newspaper. Clemens and the other starchy boys, as he once described his fellow riverboat pilots in a letter to his wife, had no particular use for this non-union man, but Clemens did envy what he later recalled to be Sellers' delicious pen name, Mark Twain. The Civil War severely curtailed river traffic, and, fearing that he might be impressed as a Union gunboat pilot, Clemens brought his years on the river to a halt a mere 2 years after he had acquired his license. He returned to Hannibal, where he joined the processionist Marion Rangers, a ragtag lot of about a dozen men. After only 2 uneventful weeks, during which the soldiers mostly retreated from Union troops rumored to be in the vicinity, the group disbanded. A few of the men joined other Confederate units, and the rest, along with Clemens, scattered. Twain would recall this experience, a bit fuzzily and with some fictional embellishments, in the private history of the campaign that failed, 1885. In that memoir he extenuated his history as a deserter on the grounds that he was not made for soldiering. Like the fictional Huckleberry Finn, whose narrative he was to publish in. The next few years were important for Clemens. After he had finished writing the Jumping Frog story but before it was published, he declared in a letter to Orion that he had a call to literature of a low order, i.e. humorous. "It is nothing to be proud of," he continued, "but it is my strongest suit." However much he might deprecate his calling, it appears that he was committed to making a professional career for himself. He continued to write for newspapers, traveling to Hawaii for the Sacramento Union and also writing for New York newspapers, but he apparently wanted to become something more than a journalist. He went on his first lecture tour, speaking mostly on the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, in 1866. It was a success, and for the rest of his life, Though he found touring grueling, he knew he could take to the lecture platform when he needed money. Meanwhile, he tried, unsuccessfully, to publish a book made up of his letters from Hawaii. His first book was in fact the celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County and Other Sketches, 1867, but it did not sell well. That same year, he moved to New York City, serving as the traveling correspondent for the San Francisco Alta California and for New York newspapers. He had ambitions to enlarge his reputation and his audience, and the announcement of a transatlantic excursion to Europe and the Holy Land provided him with just such an opportunity. The Alta paid the substantial fare in exchange for some 50 letters he would write concerning the trip. Eventually his account of the voyage was published as The Innocents Abroad, 1869. It was a great success. The trip abroad was fortuitous in another way. He met on the boat a young man named Charlie Lyndon, who invited Clemens to dine with his family in New York and introduced him to his sister Olivia. The writer fell in love with her. Clemens's courtship of Olivia Langdon, the daughter of a prosperous businessman from Elmira, New York, was an ardent one, conducted mostly through correspondence. They were married in February 1870. With financial assistance from Olivia's father, Clemens bought a 1/3 interest in the Express of Buffalo, New York, and began writing a column for a New York City magazine, The Galaxy. A son, Langdon, was born in November 1870, but the boy was frail and would die of diphtheria less than 2 years later. Clemens came to dislike Buffalo and hoped that he and his family might move to the Nook Farm area of Hartford, Connecticut. In the meantime, he worked hard on a book about his experiences in the West. Roughing It was published in February 1872 and sold well. The next month, Olivia Susie Clemens was born in Elmira. Later that year, Clemens traveled to England. Upon his return, he began work with his friend Charles W. Warner on a satirical novel about political and financial corruption in the United States. The Gilded Age, 1873, was remarkably well received, and a play based on the most amusing character from the